welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to talk about Mark Henry WWE documentary, which was actually very good. Hope you watched it. It was 2 hours. It was a really strong 2 hours. It probably could have added a little bit more with his career, especially the bodybuilding stuff, but it was really good. I'm not going to go blow by blow into the documentary. I'm just going to talk about some things that stood out. And I want to say, for starters, if you ever heard about the movie The Blind Side, if you look at Mark Henry's relationship with the Todds, it comes across like The Blind Side. For those of you who don't know, there was a football player by the name of Michael Orr. A white family took him in and helped sponsor him throughout his career. And it ended up in a crazy lawsuit that's going on right now. But they made a movie called The Blind Side. There was books written and all this kind of stuff about, white people and white folks going and helping these poor blacks who have this phenomenal potential, but they're not quite sure how to use it, how to awaken it. And these people who are keeping him on track. That's almost exactly the same situation that we got here with Mark Henry. So Mark Henry meets Terry and Jan Todd, husband and wife. They are both sports journalists. Jan Todd is a powerlifter. I believe Terry Todd also was into powerlifting a little bit. They meet him in 1990 when he was just a teenage boy, finding out that he was really very strong. And they coached him and mentored him into being the strongest man in the world. It's an incredible story. And if you do a lot of research into their relationship, you do a lot of research into the situation that Mark Henry found himself in by not winning in the Olympics, you get a really interesting story. So for those of you who maybe you didn't watch, Mark Henry did not win a gold medal in the Olympics. In fact, he came in 14th place. In the documentary, they say he came in 10th place. But I think that's the team that came in 10th place. Mark Henry himself came in 14th place. This was in Atlanta in 1996. He is already under WWE contract by this time. He came in 10th place in Barcelona in 1992. Now, the 1996 entrance was the big one. That was the one that these guys complained a lot about. Terry Todd wrote an article called Mark Henry's Dilemma, as he tried to explain why Mark Henry, who is, as he claimed, the best natural talent to ever powerlift, did not win the gold medal. And it was essentially everybody else cheated. So before we get into all that, let's go to the Olympic Games website where they keep a list of what happened. So it says Atlanta, 1996, weightlifting, 108 kilograms, super heavyweight men's results. So 108 kilograms, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to have to actually do the math myself. According to Google, it's 238 pounds, so about 240 pounds. The gold medal went to Andrei Chmerikin, who is Russian. The silver medal went to Ronnie Weller, who is German. The bronze went to Stefan Botev-Hrisev, who is Australian. And like I said before, Mark Henry came in 14th place. Now, there was a lot of people who beat Mark Henry in that. They said Mark Henry was injured. But Terry Todd wrote an article called Mark Henry's Dilemma, Reflections on Drugs at the Olympics by Terry Todd, PhD. And he spends a lot of time talking about Mark Henry being a natural athlete, and that he would not have helped Mark Henry if Mark Henry was on steroids, and that he had him drug tested pretty regularly. He even goes on to say Mark Henry has repeatedly been tested by 6 federations, saying, quote, the American Drug-Free Powerlifting Association, the U.S. Olympic Committee, the International Weightlifting Federation, the World Drug-Free Powerlifting Federation, the World Wrestling Federation, and the International Olympic Committee have all tested Mark Henry, and they noted that Mark Henry is clean. Now, we could also draw a bright line with the World Wrestling Federation, because I don't believe at all that the World Wrestling Federation was doing any kind of strenuous steroid testing in the mid-90s. Oh, I know a couple of guys. I know Shawn Michaels got busted for steroids, and a couple of other guys did. But, come on. I wouldn't put WWF on there, okay? But he goes into the other guys on the list being cheaters. So Terry Todd writes, quote, "The man who eventually won the gold medal in Atlanta, Andrei Chimerikin, an anabolic cloud also hung over his head before the Olympic Games. What happened is that several months after Chimerikin won the World Championships last fall in China, an article appeared in an Australian newspaper stating that he had failed the drug test given at the meet. As expected, accounts of this article and Chimerikin's expected lifetime ban spread throughout the lifting community like a prairie fire. But then, no action was taken by the International Weightlifting Federation. A darker rumor began to circulate. This rumor, which came to me from several sources, at least one of which was very high-placed, alleged that there were 3 reasons Chimerikin wasn't banned. 1, because of his status as the reigning world super heavyweight champion. 2, because the IWF was already reeling from the approximate 80 positives they reported over the previous year. And 3, because the closeness of the Olympic Games would ensure unusual media scrutiny. For these reasons, the IWF had allegedly decided not to report Chimerikin's positive. Not to penalize a guilty man, to sweep it all under the rug, the head of the IWF, Tamás Aján of Hungary, denied the rumor, but it persisted nonetheless. He continues about the silver medalist, Ronnie Weller. He says, Ronnie Weller of Germany, the silver medalist, and Stefan Botev of Australia. He's from Bulgaria, actually, but he lived off and on in the past several years in Australia. During the press conference, a reporter asked Ronnie Weller, how do you respond to Mark Henry's allegations that a lifetime clean lifter, he is unable to compete with the top men in the sport since all of the top men use anabolic steroids? To which Weller said, after a pause, all of the people who are really inside the sport know the truth about this. Beyond that, I would not like to comment. In other words, he claims, he seemed to be saying that Mark was correct. This remarkable admission from the man who won gold medal in Seoul and had just won the silver medal in Atlanta took a great deal of courage. One thing is certain, there is no question that when a lifetime clean lifter like Mark Henry lifts against men using steroids, it's like taking a knife to a gunfight. He says, and lest anyone think bronze medalist Stefan Botev is being ignored, I've been told by Professor Angel Spasov and Emelian Iankov, both of whom worked with Botev when he was representing Bulgaria, that Botev, along with all the other marvelous Bulgarian lifters on the national team, was a regular user of anabolic steroids. So, despite the fact that Mark Henry came in 14th place, Terry Todd says basically the first 3 guys are well-known cheaters and basically admitted to using steroids. It doesn't explain the other 10 people who beat Mark Henry in that lift, but okay. But I guess they're trying to say that all of these guys are using steroids. Of course, it would come out much later in the 2010s. It was a huge thing about steroids, especially from Russia. And a Russian won the powerlifter. How about that? And it was a big thing in Russia about powerlifting and steroids. So if you look up like the Russia doping scandal, it came out in like the 2010s. A bunch of articles came out. That Vice did some really good reporting on powerlifting and steroids in like Britain and some other places. And this is coming out in like the 2020s and the 2010s. So you're talking about something that was 30 years ago. And Mark Henry is saying, like, I was always a clean lifter, but you can't say the same thing for all of these guys. Now, you would have had to go by one to prove all of these guys were dirty, but they're basically giving you a general idea that at least the top 3 guys were at least playing around with steroids, if not on steroids at the time. Terry Todd was also instrumental in Mark Henry becoming a WWF superstar. It was him who made the phone call to the WWF and got Mark Henry a tryout and got Mark Henry signed. And he was actually Mark Henry's manager. So you see also the parallels with The Blind Side. This guy takes an incredible interest in Mark Henry. He's a significantly older guy, white. Not that that's anything wrong with that. But you look at the blind side, you look at this guy's a recruiter, essentially. He goes out, recruits Mark Henry, grooms him into being a champion powerlifter. He kind of falls short in the Olympics, decides to pivot to pro wrestling. Here it is. It says, quote, during the games, he signed a 10-year, multi-million-dollar contract with the World Wrestling Federation. So 10 years, millions of dollars, and he was sent to train a little bit because he was so green. But because he had a huge contract without paying his dues, he was bullied quite a bit in the locker room. Bullying is a thing Mark Henry talks about extensively. Talk about being bullied as a kid and how he would just snap. And it took a while to get him there because he's such a jolly giant, And I really could relate to that, So Mark Henry gets a huge developmental contract, which they say is about $250,000 a year for 10 years. So that's $2.5 million, I believe. So his contract was for $2.5 million over 10 years, which is actually not bad for the time. So he ends up getting sent to Dr. Tom Pritchard, and he's working in the Funkin' Dojo. And we got to talk about the Funkin' Dojo a little bit, even though I've done an entire video on it. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So the WWE on its website described it as, quote, every month between January 1998 and 1999, hopeful superstars like Edge, Kurt Angle, and Jeff Hardy descended on the WWE headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut in hopes of making an impression that would land them on the company's main roster. To be considered, they'd be put through one of the most grueling weeks of their lives by former NWA World Champion and WWE Hall of Famer Dory Funk Jr. He says the Funkin' Dojo camps were some of the earliest WWE's attempts at centralized recruiting for future generations of superstars. And while the WWF Hall of Famer, along with co-trainers Tom Pritchard and Pat Patterson, pushed them to their physical limits, the punishing work paid off. Many of the graduates of the Funkin' Dojo became WWE and World Champions, Tag Champions, Intercontinental Champions, and even a Hall of Famer. So, of course, Mark Henry was there. Kurt Angle was also there. Christian was there. The Hardy Boys, Edge, Matt Hardy and Jeff Hardy was there. Edge was there. Val Venus also participated in the camp. And they also claimed that The Rock was there. But I think the Funkin' Dojo was I think it was right around The Rock's time. It might have been somewhere else where The Rock met Mark Henry. It might have been in Memphis. The thing was, Mark was sent to many developmental programs because his development was very slow. And he always needed to, lose weight or pick up a new move or two. So throughout the entirety of his run, he kept getting sent back to developmental. This was something that also happened to Rikishi a couple of times. He would balloon up in weight or something like that, and they would send him away for a while to freshen up and then bring him back. He was also sent to Calgary. This was in Bret Hart's book. It was also something he talked about with The Undertaker on a podcast, that he had a blow up in the locker room. He thought that Shawn Michaels and the Clique had taken his crutches. It turns out that it was Paul Bearer playing a rib on him, but he had threatened to kill Shawn and the Clique. And Bret decided to take him up to Calgary to train him. And actually, it was Leo Burke, who just recently passed away, who actually did the training. It was just kind of like at Bret's house. So, the old Stampede training, you pay to get trained by the Harts. And in reality, one of their old veteran friends are the ones who actually do the training. According to Bret Hart's book, Ken Shamrock, Christian, Edge, Test, and Teddy Hart were also there. So he trained a lot with Edge and Christian, seemingly. They were crossing paths quite a bit. His relationship with The Rock is what led to them two working together in Nation of Domination. They didn't spend a lot of time on that, which was probably for the best. Not that I didn't like the Nation of Domination, but considering that was more about Ron Simmons and more about The Rock, less about Mark Henry. I mean, we got to hear that Ron Simmons took an interest in him and was actually, one of his mentors. So that was good. They talked about sexual chocolate, that the entire idea was Mark Henry's idea. He wanted to be more charismatic and show off his personality. Vince loves to see big guys smiling. He likes to see people happy. And if you're smiling, then the people will be happy and all that kind of stuff. Smiles on faces. And Mark Henry didn't want to be like the, I guess, angry wrestler. He wanted to be, kind of the big fun-loving guy. And so before Big Daddy V, we got Sexual Chocolate Mark Henry. And this was, as Mark Henry said, it was his idea to do the gimmick. But everything he did was something that the writers came up with. That means Vince Russo came up with it. So Mark Henry claimed in the documentary that he came up with the name Sexual Chocolate. Vince Russo, in the WrestleCrap article about Sexual Chocolate, claims he came up with the name from his Puerto Rican and Italian friend Jeff Iorio. So we don't know where it came from. I'm more in line to believe that it came from Mark Henry, because it sounds like something a black man would come up with. And if you saw the movie Coming to America, Sexual Chocolate was a whole thing in that movie. And I know a black boy from Silsbee, Texas, have seen Coming to America. I just know he did. I'm not so sure Vince Russo saw it, but I'm almost positive that Mark Henry saw it. So Vince Russo said this, quote, "When writing for Sexual Chocolate, I always looked at him as Chef from South Park. So that was definitely an inspiration for the character. However, there was never anything creepy about Mark Henry. It was all done in the name of comedy." He says, yes, it was comedy when Mark Henry realized that he was indeed coming on to a male transvestite, when in fact he thought she was a hottie toddy of the opposite sex. It was also comedy when Terry Reynolds and Miss Jackie stuffed a ball gag down his gullet. He never asked for that. Yes, Sexual Chocolate was attracted to women, but a sex addict that was never even on my radar. At the end of the day, I just felt that putting Mark in this light would bring some entertainment to the show, and it did. Well, Mark Henry liked the character. Mark Henry also said that Vince McMahon liked the character. A lot of the fans liked it. Unfortunately, it pigeonholed him in the mid-card. There's not much you can do with a 400-pound sex machine, I guess you could say. I don't know why he decided to do that, but he wanted to show some personality and show some charisma, and he did that. Sexual Chocolate will never be forgotten. Of course, they didn't go into any real detail about why Mae Young had to give birth to a hand, and that literally didn't make any sense. It literally is senseless. Vince Russo claimed on WrestleCrap that he was already gone by the time the idea of Mae Young giving birth to a hand had come up. But this is also the same Vince Russo who was still taking credit for the WWF in 2000, claiming he wrote 2 years worth of stories and they were still working on it the entire time. So take that with a grain of salt. Now, the thing that they, of course, did not spend a lot of time on, they didn't talk about it at all, was the racism that Mark Henry faced, particularly at the hands of Michael Hayes. There was a couple of occasions, of course, the big one that took place in 2008, and the one about Silverback that came later, that wasn't Michael Hayes specifically, but it was somebody in the writing team. So they didn't mention this, but they did mention it indirectly. It was so strange how they did this. So Mark Henry has a daughter who's into shot put, apparently, and she claimed that one of the bullies in her school called her a gorilla. And that instantly was like, oh, is Mark Henry going to tell the story about, the writing team coming up with the Silverback storyline? No, he didn't mention it at all. So in any event, what happened in like 2007 or 2008? So apparently after a WrestleMania, there was, some drinks flowing. This is in, of course, April of 2008. And Michael Hayes says to Mark Henry, "I'm more of a nigger than you are." Michael Hayes was suspended for 60 days for inappropriate behavior. And Michael Hayes later, in his sit-down interview with JBL, he actually addressed this, claiming he's not a racist because he has a black daughter. But it is not really his daughter. It's more like a child that he takes care of because he had a second or third wife who had a black child. It was very ridiculous. He also tells stories about himself and Terry Gordy listening to Richard Pryor records in the car. And this, of course, he had to go through all this because he also, the Freebirds used to wear the Confederate flag, and there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that. But he told the story and basically said it was up to Mark Henry whether he got fired or not. And that Mark Henry showed him some grace, and is the only reason he's still around today is because Mark Henry was okay with it. He admitted that at the time he needed to be humbled, and the situation did, of course, correct him. Several years later, of course, we know that a new push was being put together for Mark Henry, and they came up with the nickname Silverback, and Mark Henry refused to do it. I don't believe there was ever stated what individual writer came up with that name, but of course, Mark Henry shot it down. They did discuss what led to the Hall of Pain, the big rib, where Vince sent Mark Henry out in front of a crowd with no one there. This took place in like 2010 and 2011. The idea being is that Vince wanted to see some anger and some frustration out of Mark Henry. He wanted Mark to be believably angry. And in order to do that, they would periodically piss him off. And he felt like, okay, I've been here for a while. I don't deserve the hazing. I'm going to quit. And in the documentary, he said something that I really liked. He said, that's my office. That's where I make money. Don't play like that. And everybody saw that he was so angry. And they had the video here, which was great. They showed the video of Mark just fuming. And I'm like, my God. He looked like he could just melt the turnbuckles. Like everything was just like turned into sludge at his feet. That's how angry he was. That's how much heat that was generating off this guy. And that's what Vince wanted to see. And this, of course, led to the Hall of Pain. Now, in looking it up, Dave Meltzer claims that the rib that they played on Mark Henry was actually a rib on the city itself due to a poor turnout. And so they decided that they would leave Mark Henry out in the ring for who knows how long as they played the theme music for various wrestlers that did not come out. And that doesn't make sense. But whatever it was, Mark Henry was pretty goddamn mad at the time. So it was a great documentary. It was fun. Sports Illustrated did an article on Mark Henry in 1991. Written by a guy named Shelley Smith, where they talked about Mark Henry breaking 4 national junior records in powerlifting with only 8 months of supervised training, that he was one of the greatest natural talents of all time in terms of powerlifting. And they did a good job of really putting that over here, showing that he was, able to bend frying pans and push cars. And they were coming up with all these crazy feats of strength for him to do, which for me, that would have been the perfect time to make him a main event guy, is when he was doing the feats of strength. But that's just me. But it was a really fun documentary. I really liked it. Some of the stuff they left out, I think, just were things that they could have expanded on. But otherwise, it was pretty good. Guy's got a great family. They mentioned AEW, which was a surprise. But there was nothing that I thought was a major thing that they didn't mention outside of his issues with like Michael Hayes and the writing staff. But let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys later.